from Manila, Philippines. And it says, how do you explain God as a loving God who created a loving world to the poor and marginalized, those who are losing jobs, difficulty getting access to food during this time of pandemic? So people just feel like God's abandoned me. You know, the wealthy can make it okay, but God's abandoned me. How do we even begin that conversation about God?
You know, that's such a good question. The full force of this question hit me a few weeks ago. I was being interviewed by a journalist who works for one of the world's most famous financial journals. And he was asking me about the pandemic, and we were talking about exactly this. I was saying, have we ever thought about how this is going to impact everyone else? So I said to him, you and I are living in a home. He was happy because he was with his family more. I was happy because I was seeing my family more. I said, we have space, we have room around us. So this feels like a good experience for us right now. But that isn't true for the vast majority of people in the world. And it's like we're fighting one battle. We feel like we're fighting a battle on one front, but actually we're fighting a battle on multiple fronts, and we have to take a big picture. And then I talked with him about some of these projections and what it could mean for everyone else. And shortly, just before Ravi's memorial service, I needed to pick up a new jacket because the one I brought with me, I hadn't noticed, had a hole in it from a moth. And the two gentlemen who were serving me did such an excellent job. And we got talking about COVID-19 and the lockdown. And I just simply said to both of them, my fear is that the response to this pandemic has been the response of the rich. And they both froze, turned at each other, turned to me, and with one voice said, yes. And I said, you know what, if you have to work to put food on your table, this is a very bad response. Mm-hmm. And so this is where I think we actually have to re-examine some things. If you're in a poor part of the world and obesity isn't an issue, you're going to be naturally less at risk from dying from pandemic anyway. If the average age in the country you're in is measured in its 20s, rather than its 50s or 60s, you're in a whole other different category. And so we have to actually think the actions that we're taking here, how are they impacting everyone else? And so the reason why what's happening right now and how this may affect the poor isn't so much the problem of suffering, it's actually the moral issue we were talking about. And what has really surprised me in all of this, and I'll be honest, when I read this story in CNN, and then I started to look at other secular parts of the media, which would normally pride themselves on being so world conscious and concerned, for the poor and the marginalized and the people who are often forgotten, I can remember thinking, how come you've dropped this story? How come you reported on it for 2 days and then you just dropped it? Is it too difficult for you to ask the question, what we're currently doing is saving millions of lives. It may be measured in hundreds of millions elsewhere. Are there other ways in which we should be thinking of nuancing our response here? How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we protect the elderly? How do we protect those who are naturally predisposed to get the brunt of this, while at the same time realizing that there's risk in all of life, and you can't eliminate all of risk. So the response has to be differentiated. I'll give one last example. I was talking with McClatchy today, who, Alicia, you'll know, he's our director, African director. And he told me the story, but I had forgotten it. I was reminded of it this morning. We were talking about something else, and I've been reading the Financial Times, and in it, there's a graph about the excess number of deaths in every single country, going country by country by country. And in South Africa, they have been less excess deaths overall since the pandemic hit than more. It's the only country in the world to have a drop. And I mentioned this to him, and he said, well, Michael, that's what I said to you 5-6 weeks ago. When they went into lockdown, they closed all the liquor stores because all the liquor stores had been shut down. People dying through violent acts, car accidents, and that kind of stuff. All of that dramatically dropped massively to such an extent that the overall loss of life on average since the pandemic started is less, not more. Of course, he then said, he said, that's an amazing statistic. He says, but here's what's happened. The government, because of the pressure it's come under, is now reopening all the liquor stores. So now it will be going into those excess death numbers. So it just again goes to highlight that the way we respond to this can have a very dramatic effect to our society as a whole. And maybe we just need to have a more holistic response. Otherwise, the poor and the marginalized will be hit hardest with that. And that isn't the right response for us to be making right now. And I hope those who are watching this and those who are in the church will feel that the church historically has been the one willing to step out and incur additional risk to save those around it, which is why during the pandemics in the 1st and 3rd centuries in the early church history, certainly in the second one, you were 8 times more likely to survive, historians think, than if you knew a Christian than if you didn't. Not you're 8 times more likely to survive if you are a Christian, 8 times more likely to survive if you knew one. In other words, everybody else was running away, but Christians were willing to go out onto the streets and help the poor who couldn't run away and didn't have the resources to leave. They ministered to them, often at the cost of their own lives, when they would then die from the disease that they were trying to rescue other people from. But the people they were ministering to, their survival rate went through the roof, and that made a massive difference. And it partly explained why so many of people in that world after they went through that pandemic in the 3rd century turned to Christ. So Christians at this point, more than any other, shouldn't be driven by fear at this point, but by love. That doesn't mean we're irresponsible. It doesn't mean we do stupid things. But it does mean that there's a strength we should be able to call on at such a time like this to help those who are least able to fend and stand up for themselves.